now for the students at home. Okay, so for the students at home, we talked about the negative event that happened last night with the debate. It was just awful, and we won't say any more about that. If you watched it, just put it in your memory banks as a historic moment, and hopefully we'll never experience something like that again as a country, because that was not good, right? I mean, we can all agree on that. All right, so what we're going to do, though, is jump into the lectures now on the Greeks. And what we've got is I've given you 3 lectures. Let me share the screen here. Okay. And they were 14, 13, and 12. And the strategy here is simple. And for you students at home, I apologize, but there's about 14 students. The train left the station and they didn't get on it. And they need a little time to catch up to the train. So we're slowing the train down. You guys maybe, how many of you have other classes and you're a little bit stressed because you got a whole much work to do and you're a little behind? Raise your hand if you got classes that are really clobbering you right now. Yeah. So this is my attempt to try to slow things down, because normally you'd have three more study guides, 3 different ones on the Greeks, about 15 questions each. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 45 questions, nearly 50. Instead, what I'm going to do is just combine a 1 study guide and have no more than, say, 20 to 30 questions, and make it a lot less work so that you can catch up. But also, too, we're trying to allow other students a chance to catch up to the train and catch on board. Now, here's the deal. Pay attention. I'm not going to have any more deadlines the rest of the year. It's up to you. But keep up. Because what will happen with 2 weeks left to go after Thanksgiving, the semester will end. And when the semester ends, you can't turn in any more work. So if you're 5 lessons behind and you only get 3 of them done, and that last week you're trying to cram and get them all in, it's not going to happen. And you're going to have an A, and then you're going to drop to a B because you didn't get everything turned in. So we'll be very generous with deadlines, but I'm just warning you, there is a day when the semester ends, and if all the work isn't in, then you're in big trouble. So keep up, keep pace, stay on the train, and you'll be fine. And the last 2 weeks, you'll just have a couple of study guides to go, and then you'll have math tests and everything else to worry about. And you'll be caught up in my class, and you'll be in good shape. Now, the students at home, they've all got all their assignments done already. So they're thinking, wow, come on, guys, let's get on this train and get going, right? But the point is that we need to slow down and give everybody a chance to do well. So we're going to do that. All right, so this lecture, now I'm going to combine with 15, 16, and maybe 17, probably 15 and 16, into 1 study guide instead of 2. So instead of getting 2 study guides a week, you'll get 1 going forward. And every now and again, like right now with the Greeks, there's no point in not having, you got 3 lectures there. Let's go ahead and just do 1 study guide for that group. Okay, so this is the next study guide. So I'll have the study guide for 14, 13, and 12 up tonight by about 6 o'clock. So you'll be able to go online and answer those questions and get that turned in. Okay, that sound good? All right, here we go. So hopefully everybody at home heard that. Just important information. All right, so here we are. Now, this is lecture 15, and you guys remember, it's kind of to review a little bit what happened with the Greeks. You understand we had the Peloponnesian War, right? And the Peloponnesian War, basically, Athens turned itself into kind of an island, if you will, surrounded by a wall. And they had their port, and all of the food and everything was coming in the port. And they had 300,000 people crammed in behind these walls. And you had the Spartans out here yelling and screaming insults, but couldn't really do much about it. And the guy that came up with this strategy of basically starving the Spartans, making the Spartans just, weaken and weaken every day, was Pericles. This is Pericles' strategy, right? Pericles' strategy was upended somewhat, though, when the plague hit. And you guys, of course, know that, we're in the middle of a pandemic, of course, but we've got all of the advantages that they didn't have, right? We have modern science. We have ventilators. We have oxygen tanks. We know to wear masks. We know to socially distance. we have all of these things that they wouldn't have had back then. They were crammed in together, no social distancing, spreading this disease, this plague throughout the city, and half of the city dies. Boy, aren't we glad we live today? Because these epidemics, these things happen on a recurring basis. And in the ancient past, in the classical world, through the Middle Ages, all the way up until really recently, we didn't have the tools to fight them. So we're living in a lucky time, we really are. And so these guys were hurt by the plague, but even at that, Athens still emerges the richest city, the biggest population, and they could still win this war with Sparta. But their great leader, Pericles, perishes. He gets the plague as well, and he dies. In fact, there wasn't any cure for it as far as they were concerned. So we had these herbal medicine kind of doctors, if you will, give him a little bag full of herbs, and he was to wear it, and it was to ward off the evil spirits or something like that. And he thought it was folly. He said, this is all I've got. This is it. This is all we can come up with to fight this plague. And he dies. So the rebuilder of Athens, the person that planned the strategy to win the war against the Spartans, perishes. And that is a bad thing, because then a group called the demagogues, right? Because they used demagoguery and basically attacking anybody that disagreed with them. They convinced Athens to go to war on the offensive, to leave their walled city, to get a big army and expose them to the front lines in Sicily, that they were going to take this island, they were going to grab its natural resources, make themselves even richer, and upend the Spartans in this foreign land. It was a dumb idea. And one of the guys that thought it was such a dumb idea was a philosopher who was walking around Athens named Socrates. And he said, this is not, look, it may work. You may succeed. But in those times, taking those ships this far, remember what happened with the first Persian fleet? The whole fleet was lost here in a storm. But even if you do get there, what makes you think you're going to win? And he questioned it. And he had a lot of his young students that followed him around questioning this strategy. The guy that planned the strategy, the key demagogue, right, was a little different as a person, if you will. And he as he launches this attack, he is then called back to Athens, and they put him on trial for something or another. And he said, well, I'm not going to do that. He goes and joins the Spartan side. He goes to Sparta and is an advisor to the Spartans. So the person that plans the strategy is now working for the Spartans. That can't be good. And of course it wasn't. And then you realize they lose that. They exposed their army that they needed at home. They weren't the troops to man the walls anymore. And a lot of their ships had been sunk. And then the Persians jump in and give the Spartans a fleet. And we all know what happens next. So the great empire that wins the Battle of Salamis in 490, 85 years later, loses its empire, loses its ships. 200-300 warships were burned right in front of their very eyes. And can you imagine the humiliation of having to go to those long walls, and you as a person of Athens, brick by brick, having to dismantle your own defenses right in front of the Spartan army? Humiliation, if you will. Pericles would never have allowed them to sail. Socrates was saying, dumb idea. But these demagogues, that's what they were called, they refused to believe that they had done anything wrong. There had to be somebody else to blame, right? It wasn't them. It wasn't their bad judgment. It wasn't their bad idea. Somebody else was responsible. And so what they're going to do is they're going to arrest Socrates and take him to trial for questioning, just asking questions about the stupidity of this idea, of this invasion. Well, that's a simplified version of the story, but before we get into that one, it's really an important one, I want to talk about the 7 wonders of the ancient world, because I don't think we all got through that last time. Some of the classes didn't get them all. I want to make sure you understand what they were. Now, what's interesting to me is as beautiful as the Parthenon was, now remember the Acropolis is the mountaintop, and on top of that was their temple. And so this is the Parthenon. So this building's the Parthenon sitting on top of the Acropolis. So you need to know that, right? So when you go to Greece, you'll know. And when you go to Greece, by the way, they do like a light show and kind of a play at night. It's really cool. You go this summer and they're telling the stories and they got these figures going around, these lights on these old ancient ruins. They got a big theater too that's right below this that was built in ancient times. That's part of the pageantry. If you're in Greece, grab some Greek food, go out to the park and watch this. It's free. At least it was when I was there. And it's just a really cool thing. Athens is a great city if you ever get a chance to go. But what they're going to be guilty of is a thing called hubris. Now, that's a big word and it's in big bold letters, so I want you to memorize it. Hubris is arrogance. It's thinking that you can do no wrong. It's like, you know, I'm right, you're wrong. And if you disagree with me, then an idiot. It's arrogance to the point of making stupid decisions. See, the Athenians had become full of arrogance. Their hubris grew. And there's a speech that Pericles gives called the Oration of Pericles before he dies. It's in the middle of the plague. He's trying to bolster everybody's attitudes, right? We're going to survive this. We're going to still win the war, all that kind of stuff. But it is so arrogant. He's talking about how Athens can do no wrong. Look what Athens did. Little tiny Athens took on the Persian Empire and beat them at Marathon. Then little tiny Athens took on the Persians and beat them at Salamis. We should be able to handle the Spartans too, because they're like teeny tiny compared to the Persians. They overestimated themselves, they overestimated the ability, and this word hubris is arrogance. And what great country, what great power doesn't go through this? You look at Germany during World War I and World War II, they thought they couldn't be beat. The Empire of Japan. Americans can be like that. America can do no wrong. America's going to do everything right. Our empire will go on forever. The Chinese feel that way about themselves. We've been a power for 5,000 years. Why should we stop now? Russia, every country has this feeling of invincibility, this hubris. And sometimes it backfires on you. And that's what's going to happen, of course, with the Athenians, all right? All right, so here we have Pericles, rebuilds the Parthenon, whatever, and yet the hubris that he exhibits and underestimating the Spartans is going to lead to their demise. Now, saying that, let's do a quick review, though, because we do need to know the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it's still a stunner to me that this is not on the list. They should have the 8th wonder of the ancient world. But number 1 is the Pyramid of Giza. You guys know that one, right? We covered that before. And then we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That's pretty cool, right? Then we had the statue of Zeus at Olympia. This is review. This is where the Olympics were held. And I guess that statue in that area where he was enshrined, right, as their top god. This was the main god of the Greeks, right? Was pretty cool. Then there's the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which is in Turkey, but it was a Greek city-state. 120 years to build, and I guess it was just stunning. Here's some of the ruins around it. Here's the goddess herself, Artemis. Then the mausoleum at Mausolus at Hyrcanussus. Boy, that's a mouthful. And this is the origin of the word mausoleum. It was built by the Persians to honor one of their leaders, and then the Greeks took it over. As you're going to see, they take over Persia. And then, of course, during the Crusades, the Crusading Knights kept it up. And so this one survives. So the pyramids survive. This didn't, this didn't, this didn't, but this did. Anyway, then there's my favorite, which is the Colossus of Rhodes. It wouldn't have survived. It didn't survive. But this was an amazing iron statue. Think of the Statue of Liberty, right? It was almost as big. And to get into its port, you had to sail right underneath it as he stood over these 2 pillars, the Colossus of Rhodes. That must have been a sight when you come in with your boat, right? Your ship coming into that port of Rhodes. It was broken down, taken down, and melted down for its metal. What a shame. But then there's the last one on the list, which is probably one of the coolest. And this is the reason we're ending on this is the lighthouse of Alexandria, Egypt. See, as we're going to learn in the next 2 lectures, Alexander the Great is going to conquer the Persian Empire. So that means he's going to take Egypt, Mesopotamia, into civilization, and expand even beyond what the Persians had. He had a bigger empire than the Persians. Okay, so they built this huge, this is the Hellenistic Greeks, this huge lighthouse. Why? Because you had ships, and mostly the ships would have to wait out in the ocean at night, and so they could navigate up the Nile and get up to what we now call Giza. So they built this pyramid so the ships would know which way to come so they could keep sailing at night. And they, of course, had big fires, big bonfire every night. They'd have to haul the wood up here and burn it. But it could be seen forever. So you just sailing across, night vision, sail right to it, go to a little bit to the left, and you're fine. Sail up the river, and you can keep going. It was quite a sight. And yeah. Now, an earthquake toppled it, so it ended up in the ocean. And scuba divers can go down and still see big chunks of it down there under the water. All right, well, now what else happens though in Athens that's important? And that is the development of what we call philosophy, right? And this is all going to tie back to Pericles, going to tie back to that other stuff in a minute. But there was a group in Athens, and why do we still talk about Athens? Because they developed so much of what became the philosophy of Western Europe and the Americas. It originally starts with a group called the Sophists. And the Sophists were, originally the word was craftsmen, but basically these were popular teachers or lecturers, so think college professors. They were paid to teach the young noblemen of Athens all the skills they would need in their future. And the Sophists, teacher in ancient Greece during the 5th and 4th centuries, they specialized in subjects such as philosophy, rhetoric, music, athletics, mathematics. They taught arete, which is virtue or excellence. And this was to the young statesmen and nobility that would be running Athens in the future. Now, you're sitting there in school because of these guys. Because these guys basically defined some of the subjects that we still study today. Mathematics, athletics, music, philosophy. We don't get as much of that as we used to. Rhetoric. We used to teach rhetoric in all of our schools 100 years ago. We don't teach much of it anymore. But rhetoric is what we needed last night, a little rhetorical training. How do you discuss your position with another person in a debate? These are skills that you should learn if you're going to be president of the United States. You should learn how to debate, how to discuss in a reasonable way so people can follow the arguments. Now, rhetoric is the art or technique of persuasion through the use of oral or written language. There's skills to it, how you say things the right way. Sometimes people use rhetoric in the wrong way. It can have something that sounds logical, but is actually kind of confusing and is meant to deceive, right? It's verbal sleight of hand. It sounds good, but it's not true. So rhetoric is a skill that you learn, and it's something that you can use for good or for evil, right? I mean, let's face it. Let me give you an example. Let's take a problem and dissect it. You ready? So one of the contests at the Olympic Games is the javelin throw. Now the javelin, of course, is used in war. It's a weapon that these javelin throwers would throw these huge javelins. They'd be so heavy that if they hit you, right, they could cause tremendous damage. And they were an important weapon. But in the Olympics, they would see who could throw it the farthest. We still do it. We still have the javelin throw. It's great to watch. I mean, you get these guys out there with the javelins and they have to do certain steps and they hurl it and it goes 200-300 feet. I mean, we're literally talking nearly the length of a football field. And if it's a weapon of war, it'll stick right through somebody's armor as it comes down, right? Okay, so imagine this. You're at the Olympic Games and guess what? You're having the javelin competition. And one of the javelin throwers throws the javelin and a guy walks out there and gets hit by the javelin and dies. So the question then for your rhetorical education is who's guilty? Well, at first you might say, well, the person that threw the javelin's guilty because he's the one that threw it and this guy got hit. But wait a minute, maybe it's not the person that threw the javelin, it's the organizers of the event that didn't make the area safe and have enough ropes and stuff, says don't go by here because we're throwing the javelins here. Or maybe it's the person himself that jumped the rope and just ran out onto the field and got himself stabbed by a javelin that had to be hurling through the air at about 30 miles an hour. Who is guilty here? Was it the javelin itself? The very design of the javelin, that maybe for a competition like the Olympics, you don't use a weapon, use something that's like the weapon, but if it hits somebody, it won't hurt. Let me give you an example. How many of you ever played this game in the summer where you throw these darts in the air at a circle out on the lawn? Lawn darts, I think it's called. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. How many play lawn darts? Yeah? Okay, I see a few hands going up. Well, when I was a kid, the first lawn darts had metal tips, heavy metal tips. And what was happening is kids were throwing them and their little brothers were running out and getting hit in the head, and it was sending them to the hospital. So obviously the design of the lawn dart was at fault. It had pointy tip on it, heavy metal. So now the lawn darts are plastic, right? They're just, they can't hurt anybody. It can sting, but it's not gonna send you to the hospital. So maybe it's the design. So maybe it's the maker of the javelin that is to blame. So who do you sue in court? Who do you blame? We have the same debate with guns in this country, right? You got somebody out hunting deer, they fire, I think they're shooting at a deer, and somebody is out there hiking and gets shot. Who's responsible for that arm that just got a bullet, you know? Is it the person that fired the gun, or is it the hiker who should have been wearing maybe orange? Or is it the organizers of the hunt here in Utah that should have marked clearly hunting in this area, hiking over here? Or was it the fact that we use guns for deer hunting instead of maybe just bows and arrows? Who's really to blame? So basically what they're saying is life is a little more complicated than we sometimes want to make it. So we have to think through all of the different levels of issues to get to the bottom of something. So this is what we call relativism. And so in Western thought, it's called relativism, where it's relative to the situation. In some situations, it's the organizer of the event. In another situation, it might be the person that was irresponsible throwing it. Another situation might be the person that jumped the line when they were in an area they weren't supposed to be and got themselves hurt. It's relative, right? Basically, their idea was there's no fundamental good or bad, that these are just things that happen. It's kind of a cynical position that in ancient Athens bordered on atheism, because these guys didn't think the gods were all that great. They basically thought Zeus and Saturn and Venus and all that was just a bit silly, that these gods were capricious. They would do weird things like just throw a lightning bolt at somebody just to see what happened. They weren't, you know, and so they discredited the gods. In fact, the Athenians were pretty religious people. There was one festival where you'd have a little altar outside of your house and you'd take some meat and you'd put it out there at night. And of course, what happens to things that are left out, they desiccate, they basically disintegrate. We still see it happening in parts of Asia where they put fruit and vegetables out for the spirits, right? And as it desiccates, what happens? The spirits are taking that food out. So it's like an offering. So they were doing it. These guys would walk around and destroy the altars. So they're pretty disruptive. But it is the beginning of what we call the humanistic age, because these guys, starting with Protagoras, and you guys know him, right? Protagoras went so far as to say, man is the measure of all things. Don't equate yourself with the gods. We can't even understand the gods. Man is the center. Man is the measure of all things. And this is the beginning of what we call humanism. Now, I know these terms are kind of coming at you. I know this is a ninth grade class, but these are the kinds of things that you need to start understanding a little bit as you get into college. What is humanism? What is relativism? Right? Now, in Athens, this threatens to erode the moral structure of the society that had always believed one thing. And these guys are wanting to change all that and have people think a different way. So there's a little bit of disruption here. And one of the guys that got smack dab in the middle of this argument with the sophists and the more, what would you call Zeus supporting groups was Socrates. Now, Socrates wasn't a sophist. He disapproved of the sophists for ethical reasons because he thought they were using their skills in the wrong way. He adopted a radically different approach to teaching and wisdom. He accepted no fee. The sophists all got paid. He adopted this self-effacing posture. In other words, he was humble. In fact, he didn't have any possessions. He basically had a robe and no shoes and whatever, and he probably didn't bathe but once a year. But he wandered around teaching using a thing called the Socratic method. This is another one you need to know. So look at the terms we're teaching: relativism, humanism, Socratic method. Socratic method is where you ask questions to get to the bottom of an issue. You ask a series of questions to get to the bottom of the issue. Have you guys ever been like traveling with your parents in the car and you're going someplace distant, right, on vacation or whatever? And as a young kid, maybe your brothers and sisters still do it. They say, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" Raise your hand if you're guilty of that. I know I was. But here's the deal. When you're 5, you don't understand. "Oh, we'll be there in an hour." You don't know what that means. An hour? What's an hour? How long is that going to be? How long do I got to sit here with this seatbelt on, right? The real question the kid's asking, can I get out of the car and go play? The parents, though, the more you ask that question, the more frustrated they become. And raise your hand if your parents ever got frustrated when about the 5th time you asked the same question, "Are we there yet?" Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about, right? We've all experienced that. Why? Because constant questioning is uncomfortable. And that's why Socrates was seen as somebody that could cause great discomfort. He called himself the gadfly of Athens. Now, a gadfly is a kind of a big horsefly, right? You guys, how many have ever been bitten by a horsefly up in the mountains? Raise your hand. You know what I'm talking about? Horseflies? I don't see any hands. Let me see. Let me escape out here and stop sharing really fast. Raise your hand if you know what a horsefly is. Okay, does it hurt? Yeah, about 10 times worse than a mosquito bite, right? Okay, so imagine, here's what Socrates is calling himself. He's calling himself the gadfly of Athens. It's his job, he thinks, right, to go around and to bite the horse of Athens, like Athens is a horse, and bite it and cause it to move and cause it to rethink and cause it to think for a while. He considers a service to challenge. So, for example, when he challenged the Syracuse expedition, he was being a gadfly. He was giving an alternative opinion and saying, "That's a dumb idea." And he's asking him these uncomfortable questions that this group that wanted to have that happen, the demagogues, were uncomfortable with. And so when the expedition failed, they weren't willing to accept responsibility for their failure. They decided to blame Socrates, that Socrates convinced the young people that this was a stupid idea. And suddenly their ideas weren't popular anymore. And all of a sudden, he became the problem, not their own stupidity. People have a hard time accepting responsibility. When you think about how important Socratic method is, pay attention to me really fast. Most people don't understand the issues at all. They have an opinion. Climate change is real or climate change isn't, right? But they don't understand at all what climate change is, right? Who can tell me, let me stop the share here. Who can tell me why the climate is warming up? And I promise not to embarrass you. Why is the climate heating up? Okay, we got in the back there, go ahead.
So what's happening is, I was burning coal and stuff. CO2 is getting in the atmosphere, and it's kind of concentrating in the heat of the atmosphere. So heat comes into the sun during the day, and normally without all the CO2 in the air, it would escape. But it's through the greenhouse gas effect to keep it in sort of limit, which is causing us to have this climate.
Yeah, wow, okay, that's great. Okay, so Now let's take it a step further, right? Raise your hand if you think it's all man-made. Okay, good, because it's not all man-made. But how many thinks man contributes to this? Right? And listen, it's really complicated. So let's follow up on what you just said. Great job, by the way. Here's the thing. When we started the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, we started to burn coal in our trains and in our factories and whatever. And coal releases carbon into the atmosphere, right? And then we get cars and we put more carbon in the atmosphere. Well, what happens is that tips the balance of carbon. Now, there's naturally occurring carbon, right? But as the planet starts to warm up, guess what? The permafrost in the Arctic now starts to melt. When it starts to melt, more carbon that's been trapped in the ice and trapped in the permafrost is released. We're talking about methane, we're talking about other gases that suddenly hit. And so what we have is a spiraling problem that's multifaceted. How do we take this carbon and reduce it? Well, there's lots of ways. It's called sequestration. You take the carbon, right, and you literally put it back into the ground. But that's complicated and it's expensive, but we got to do something. Last night's debate, the only thing that made sense to me was that we need to have a plan of how we're going to deal with climate change, because here's the deal. It's already happened. So now we have to deal with the consequences. And how are we going to do that? And it's going to take a lot of questions, a lot of science, a lot of technology to understand how all this is all happening and how we can then live on this planet comfortably in the century to come. It's going to be one of the great challenges of your lives. So get your degrees, get your engineering degrees, get your science, get your math. Ask questions below the surface. If you ask most people, they won't give a good answer like you gave. They won't even know what it is. They won't even know, well, what's carbon? And if you ask one or two questions, you're going to find that their understanding is so shallow that their opinion is based on nothing but bias and prejudice. It's hubris. So what you're doing in school is you're learning to think scientifically. You're learning to think like the Greeks would have you think, dig deeper into the issues as to what's actually happening. And so that's what Socrates means by the Socratic method. Keep asking those questions. It's the beginning of the scientific method. You keep asking questions until you get down to the fundamental truths of why things are happening. It's the same thing with this coronavirus. How is it spread? How do we stop it? Can you imagine how thrilling it would be to be one of the people working on a vaccine right now and actually come up with a vaccine that works? How much education do you need to do that? How much technology training do you need to do that? How many serious questions, deeper questions are you going to have to ask and answer in order to get to that? What a great job that would be. And of course, to do that, that would take education, right? Well, but here's the thing. These demagogues decided that Socrates was the problem. They weren't the problem. Socrates was the problem. So they put him on trial. One of his famous quotes was, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human." We need to examine our reality and think about where we are and not delude ourselves with magical thinking. We've got to solve problems. So what happened is they put Socrates on trial for treason, for two things. One, questioning the state's actions, talking about Athens when they voted to go to war, and he's saying it was a bad idea, for having a different opinion, and then corrupting the youth. Because all these young people that would travel around with him day by day, he's asking them questions and they're learning to think for themselves. And these kids think, wait a minute, this is a dumb idea. So they weren't eager to grab their hoplite armor and go out because they thought, well, this is not going to work. So he was guilty of corrupting the youth and questioning the actions of the government. And he was found guilty. And they had two phases of the trial. The first phase was, is he guilty or innocent? It was a very close vote. There were 501 people that voted, basically the whole assembly, 501. It was very close. But then there's a second trial. What should the punishment be? And at this point, one of his students named Plato is writing all this down. The reason we know about this is Plato, a student of Socrates, writes this whole thing down in a book called The Apology, in which he is asked, okay, what do you think the punishment should be? And normally what people would say, well, okay, a fine, right? And they already had people ready to put up the money to pay Socrates' fine, or he could go into exile. That would work. Or he could take the death penalty. And nobody ever takes the death penalty, right? Essentially what they would do is leave the door of the prison open at night. You could sneak out and go somewhere else and just leave. He chose not to do that. Instead, he looked at them and said, no, I'm not going to, pay a fine or because I'm not wrong. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to ask you, the penalty would be Athens pays for all my meals every day for the rest of my life for the service I give Athens into giving them some intelligent thought and some different ideas that can help the city succeed. I am providing a service and I should be paid free meals for life for the value I'm giving you. And they just went nuts. What? So they condemned him to death. He took a poison called hemlock in a little jar about this big. We still have hemlock jars. You can find it. Its cell is still there in Athens. You should go see where he was held. And he takes the hemlock and dies. Of course, the Greeks would wash themselves before they died and whatever, and that was that. And he did that because he didn't want to have anybody else have to worry about that. And he speaks to his supporters, Plato sitting there among them, and they're all in tears, and he dies. And he dies a martyr. Listen to me now. He dies a martyr to intellectual thought, because the whole history of Greece has always been strength, war, fighting. That becomes what it means to be Greek. He's saying there's something higher than that, and it's intellectual thought and knowledge. And he dies the first martyr for education, for thought. That's a more powerful thing than all the weapons you can possibly make, all the hoplites you can possibly form, all the ships you can possibly build, that it's the mind that matters more. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human. We need to examine our situation, figure out where are we at in terms of global climate change, and what do we need to do to get through the next 100 years. And it's going to take science, technology, and engineering. It's going to take each and every one of you learning all you can to win that battle. And it's going to be one of the biggest battles of your age. So examine it, think it through. Don't go on the surface, go deep, figure it out. Now, let's look at this. We're going to talk, what you're talking about is a liberal education. Now, don't get confused when this liberal education idea with the politics of liberals and Democrats and Republicans and conservatives. That has nothing to do with that. A hallmark of a liberal education, which the Greeks, Socrates, Plato gave us, is ideally a liberal education produces persons who are open-minded and free from provincialism. That means just thinking about your own community and nobody else. Dogma, old thoughts that need to be broken up, preconceptions, and an ideology conscious of their own opinions and judgments, reflective of their actions and aware of their place in the social and natural worlds. And this comes from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And if I haven't taught you anything today, you go to the Utah Academy of Sciences, right? Utah County Academy of Sciences. Where did that idea come from? Well, Plato, right, student of Socrates, was so disillusioned with what happened in Athens, he leaves Athens in disgust. And he goes where everybody goes when they have troubles in those days, Egypt. Egypt was already 2,000 years old. Do you realize Egypt was already older than the Greeks are to us in terms of history? Greeks 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago was the pyramids were being built. So he went there for some inspiration to chill time. And then he comes back to Athens and he starts a school called the Academy. Where do you think we get the word academy and Utah County Academy of Sciences? It's from Plato. You're in a STEM school, science, technology, engineering, math. So you can solve these big problems in the future. So you can come up with the next vaccine. So you can come up with a way to help with the climate change. So you can come up with clean energy. So you can invent and create and do all those things that are going to make your children's lives better, right? That's why you're here, for this education. Now, Plato was the most illustrious student of Socrates, and he wrote books. The reason we know about Socrates is because the books that were written by Plato were many, and they were dialogues where he would argue with the sophists and use their own skills against them to win these arguments. To Socrates, virtue wasn't being the strongest soldier like the Spartan soldier. It was knowledge. Knowledge was virtue. And that's really what we're in school for, is to learn. The unexamined life is not worth living. Another correlated that is know thyself. And then they were big on this, moderation in all things. And Plato had a student named Aristotle. And Aristotle had a young pupil called Alexander the Great. So when we go down the list, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, I think I've got a map here, would conquer Persia and take this type of thinking throughout the ancient world. And this is the beginning of what we call Hellenism, where we go from the Hellenic age, the age of Greece, to Hellenism, where these ideas, these philosophies, this science, this technology, this new way of thinking was spread throughout the ancient world. When the Romans rose up, they conquered Greece, but there's a famous phrase that says the Romans conquered Greece, but then the Greeks conquered the Romans intellectually. The Romans loved Greek thought and philosophy. They would hire Greeks as their kids' instructors. So throughout the whole classical period, it's this Hellenism, it's these thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and so on that would then infuse Rome with a lot of its greatness. And it's from there that all of Western Europe and Western society is built upon. And when I say Western society, I mean Western Europe, right? And Western Europe, of course, with Columbus, would set sail the ocean blue, cross in 1492, and bring this culture, Western culture, to the Americas. So when we say the West, we mean Western Europe, starting with this infusion of ideas from the Greeks, expanding to the Romans, going to Western Europe, and then spilling over to the Americas. And that's what we mean by Western thought. We basically mean Greek thought. Think like the Greeks did. That's why when you go to universities, they have all these like sororities and fraternities, and they all use Greek letters and things like that, because the origins of your education really begin in ancient Greece, which is kind of cool, right? All right, so, well, listen, I don't want to go too much further than that. Well, we have still some time, so maybe we can get some of these other things out of the way. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this right here. All right, so one more quick review here. This is a trio that you should always remember: Socrates to Plato, Plato to Aristotle, and Aristotle to Alexander the Great. Normally here, if this was my college class that I used to teach, that we do a reading from Aristotle on virtue, what virtue means. It's a pretty cool reading, but we're going to have to skip that, of course. Now, there were other philosophies too, right? It wasn't just the sophists, and it wasn't just Socrates and his way of thinking and the Socratic method. There were others. And one of them was called the Cynics. It's the origin of the word cynicism. Now, we don't know if the word cynicism or the Cynics comes from the word dog, which is kind of weird, or school. We're not so sure. But nevertheless, the founder of this school of cynicism was Eratosthenes. He was a pupil of Socrates too, but he takes it a different direction. Now, these guys, right, were, according to Socrates, would have been kind of extremists, if you will. Wealth, popularity, and power tend to dethrone the authority of reason and changes the natural person into an artificial person. Do you follow what that meant? Let's go through that again. So wealth and popularity and power corrupt people and change their nature from a real person into an artificial person that's not real. In other words, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When people get really, really wealthy, they lose touch with common people and common needs, and they kind of live in a different kind of fantasy world, an artificial world. So the Cynics would basically say, man exists for himself alone. You have to seek Get rid of all your possessions, live in poverty, that's advantageous. And this will teach you self-control, introspection, purify your intellect, and get rid of all these external influences that could affect you. Virtue, which means knowledge, not pleasure, is the end of existence. So you spend your whole time in search of knowledge and get rid of the riches of life. Now, this would be, to Socrates, probably going a bit too far. But the leading thinker of the Cynics would be a guy called Diogenes. And Diogenes was another big important influence on Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, his tutor was Aristotle. And maybe he's just a rebellious teenager, I don't know. But he was looking for other people. He fought with Aristotle all the time. Poor Aristotle, he's trying to teach this young kid. And here's Alexander, he's wandering around, and he loved Diogenes, and he would seek him out and find him and try to have conversations with him. There's a story at the Isthmian Games. Now, they used to have the Olympic Games every 4 years, but the year before and the year after, they would have another set of games, the Isthmian Games. It's kind of like we do that right now. We have the Olympics, and then we have the Pan American Games, and we have games all over the place, Commonwealth Games, and so on. Anyway, the story goes, Diogenes was there. He was relaxing in the sunlight one morning, nice warm day. Alexander, thrilled to meet his famous philosopher, asked of this Diogenes. Remember, this is the rich prince, right? Alexander the Great. And here's Diogenes with his ragged outfit, no possessions, whatever. He asked Diogenes, is there anything, any favor I can do for you? And Diogenes looked up to this powerful prince and says, stand out of my sunlight. His shadow was falling and he was blocking the sun, so he couldn't feel the warmth. That's an interesting moment in the raising of this young kid, Alexander the Great. Alexander declared, if I were not Alexander, then I would wish to be Diogenes. He had that much respect for him. In another account, Alexander found the philosopher rummaging through a pile of human bones. That's weird, but here's the story. Diogenes explained, I am searching for the bones of your father, but I cannot distinguish them from those of a slave. What lesson is Diogenes teaching Alexander? His father was Philip the Great. Philip II built this massive army, conquered all of Greece. He inherits this from his father. And here's Diogenes going through a cemetery, fumbling through the bones. I can't see a difference between the bones of your father and the bones of a slave. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We all go to wherever it is in the afterlife, but we can't take anything with us. And that had to be a powerful lesson. So here, young Alexander the Great, who we talked about, and takes these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of ideas with him throughout the known world as he commanded one of the great military expeditions of all of humanity, becomes one of the greatest generals ever known to humanity. There's very few generals in the history of the world that rose to this level. One was Napoleon Bonaparte. Another one was Alexander. In American history, the only one that comes close is Ulysses S. Grant, maybe Dwight D. Eisenhower. So this was a momentous thing, right? Alexander the Great. And he was, of course, a product of his teachers and tutors. All right, well, that pretty much ends it for today. Think about these things, you know, as being important for your education. Think deeper than just the surface level of issues. Learn your science, learn your math, dig deep. All right, we'll see you guys later.
See ya.